Okay, welcome back everyone to the Fred. We'll continue here after our break with Marty Payne, who's going to be doing a presentation on what's in a name of individuals and teams of the 19th century, naturally, or thereabouts. And I'm going to just turn it over to you, Marty. I know you're a somewhat of a Fred veteran presenter.
But not on Zoom.
All right, you should ready. Just hit screen share.
Okay. Oop. Screen share. Gotcha.
And then you should get the dialog box. Your slideshow should be in there to select somewhere to click on.
And
there you go. Now just take it to full screen and you're ready to go.
There it is.
There you're ready. Take it away.
Okay, we're all straight. Okay. I don't know about anybody else, but I kind of missed my Friday morning breakfast at the Tuncliffe with my fellow inmates. That's inmates with two ends, not one. But as you can see, the presentation is about naming baseball teams in the 19th century, and I've ended up focusing more on teams here. So it's a topic that's interested me for a long time, but I always put it on the back burner until Tom Gilbert did something at the Fred a couple years ago, and it sort of prompted me to give it another shot. It turns out Tom had actually written an article on the topic that appeared in Baseball, the journal for of the early game, the one edited by Don Jensen. And Tom was kind enough to share that with me, so I was able to sort of review that and even incorporate some of that here. My database for this has been predominantly the Origins website. I did add some other sources along the way, but really without that Origins website, I don't think I could have done this. So thanks to Larry McRae and everybody that keeps that going, because that's a valuable site. I've used it more than once for sure. And getting started, I actually take a quote out of the article that Tom wrote, because I think it accurately describes what I'm trying to do anyhow, and is that anytime people came together to form a team, they wanted to, they came up with a name, and that is a form of communication. They're making a statement either about themselves or maybe about the times they live in. And there's a lot of things influencing that part of it. The other thing to remember here, and I think is very important, is over a very short period of time, baseball really grew by leaps and bounds. Even like between 1858 and say 1878, 20-year period with a civil war in between, teams were just proliferating all over the country from coast to coast, and they were going into every little town, village, hamlet, crossroads you could think of, and they weren't forming just one team. A lot of times they formed more than one team. So it was very popular, and I can't think of any time up to this point in American history where there would be such a demand for names. I mean, they were forming tens of thousands of teams, literally. So they had to look somewhere for names, and they looked in a lot of places, I think. One of the things that happens with this topic, I think it kind of seduces you to categorize everything. You just want to put everything in some kind of order, and which is what I did here. Tom did something similar. At first, I called these influences because I thought they were influencing the people, but I think the people actually kind of turned to these categories as a source, somewhere where they find a name that might be a little bit original or maybe not. And Tom wrote something in his article that I really liked. He said that there's a mystical nexus between the game of baseball and American character. And I really couldn't agree more on that, particularly in the 19th century. But what is American character? Or particularly, what is the American character of the 19th century? So before I even get into these other categories, I want to sort of go briefly into some sort of description of what American character was at the time. So for that, I turned to Frederick Jackson Turner in the significance of the frontier in American history, because he's writing of that time period that we are in. And he talks about what he calls the striking characteristics that went into taming the continent. And he names coarseness and strength, acuteness and inquisitiveness. Now he's got restless, nervous energy, dominant individualism, buoyancy and exuberance, and these are all the things that went into taming the continent. And writing about 30 years after this, and with Jackson or Turner in mind, Frederick Paxson in the rise of sport, he addressed this to him, and he said, when the frontier closed in the 80s, the habit of the open life was too strong to be changed offhand. The search for sport revealed a partial substitute for pioneer life, and that baseball was already adopted in small towns. So Paxson is saying all this buoyancy and exuberance that was taming the continent was now all being redirected into sports. And Paxson actually points to baseball as probably the dominant sport here. And, like I said, it's already in every town, every village, every hamlet. And, so that's where all the buoyancy and exuberance went. And so baseball is coming into its own as a cultural force. So to look at some of these sources, where they went to get names. A current historian named Ben Wilson writes about globalism in the 1850s. And in it, he describes Anglo character. And now he's not specific about Americans, but I think it's applicable here, in that he says life was a battleground in which character was continually tested. Manliness consisted in just showing resilience amid vicissitudes, but combining it with generosity of spirit, self-sacrifice, self-restraint, and self-discipline. And all these hyphenated self-words are important here. And one of the things Wilson does, he hints at a value system, but Turner really did. I mean, he's got some pretty raw traits he talks about, but he doesn't really talk about a value system. I put the Jodes up here because I thought they kind of symbolized three important concepts that went into naming a team. And that started with, you wanted to portray individual strength, courage, and determination. And I think that's Tom Joad. And then the second thing you wanted to portray was self-sacrifice. You did what you did for the team, or Joad's case, he did it for his family. Ma and Pa Joad and his sister. And the third really, I think, important part of this was a community identity, that they identified with a larger group, and in this case, that would be the Yokies. Now, Jodes might not have been from Muskogee, but they were very proud to be Yokies, in that storyline. So these concepts actually run through all the other sources for names. It's something that's consistent through it. One of the influences, I think, was the military. And David Lamoureux, writing in Baseball in the 19th Century, the source of its appeal, he made the connection between the terminology used in baseball and the military, and that it is they heavily borrowed from the military. Even contemporary writers would admit as such. Thorstein Veblen, in the theory of the leisure class, says sports shade off from the bases of hostile combat. And that the slang of athletics, by the way, is in a great part made up of extremely sanguinary locutions borrowed from the terminology of warfare. So at least for a time in the 19th century, military names were popular. It seems to wane a little bit towards the end of the 1870s, I think, but that's more of a supposition on my part than backed up by any data. So another area of or source for names was industrialization, or I prefer to call it the Protestant work ethic, because I think that's what people were getting to. And again, David Lamoureux speaks to this, and when teams were described as a well-oiled machine or playing like clockwork. And even Max Weber, writing in Capitalism and the Protestant Work Ethic, he admitted sport was accepted if it served a natural purpose, that of recreation necessary for physical efficiency. Baseball was okay as long as it served the broader purpose of producing good working people for the industrialization. But Weber also noticed a downside to it, or a flip side, in that he notices that at times baseball was played with indisciplined impulses. It was purely a means of enjoyment. There were raw instincts involved, and of course that irrational gambling instinct. So it really wasn't a perfect union at first, because we're aware that during the 1870s, with rule changes, the game became more physical and violent even. It was played by some unsavory characters. And so it wasn't a perfect union. But then by the 1890s, I think the progressive movement sort of picks up steam, and they actually, over a period of time, adopt baseball as a teaching tool for the youth of this country, in that they, to teach them all the values and virtues that were important in the Protestant work ethic. And that kind of evolves actually into what I call the Horatio Alder syndrome, where by the early 1900s, I know I'm getting out of century, but a lot of the articles written about baseball and baseball players actively refer to Horatio Alder and those type of influences. And you look at some of these names, and they were used as early as the 1840s, and they were still in use in the 1880s. So it was a significant influence on naming teams. Another area of or source for naming teams, what I call the cosmic, or the forces of nature, and that Ralph Waldo Emerson, writing in Self-Reliance, he talks about that we live in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us a receiver of its truths and organs of its activity. So, I'm not sure how you draw some kind of identifying connection here. It seems a little cold, but Emerson goes on to say that nature suffers nothing in her kingdoms which cannot help itself, and that these are demonstrations of the self-sufficing and therefore a self-reliant soul. So what Emerson, I think, is saying is that we're a self-sufficient, independent part of this grand cosmos and an overwhelming, profound force. And as part of that, you're saying, I guess the statement you're making is, I am part of something you cannot stop. So, I'm a comet. What are you going to do about it? I'm a meteor. We are lightning, and we are a hurricane, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Kind of got God on our side, I guess. So this was a source of names. I guess these would be your transcendental baseball players of the 19th century. Now, another area of influence was politics. Particularly in the election years, the campaign coffers would just open up and they would start sponsoring teams all over the place. So in Maryland, you might find the Claibornes or the Governor Lloyds. In a presidential election year, particularly during the primary season, you might find the Clevelands or the Browns or the Grants or the Bayards and anybody else that was running for president. So it was something that that was a big influence, that at least in part of the 19th century. It seems to kind of wane by 1900, even though you still see some of it. Probably one of the most influential areas for naming teams I found to be geography. It's kind of interesting to me in that W. Gordon East, writing in the geography behind history, he talks about regional geography and the impact it has on people. And he says it seeks continually to detect and define the interrelationships which exist between communities and the physical background to their work and movements. And the more important a region becomes to man, the more complex becomes in consequence the interaction of place and folk. So yeah, geography does shape our thinking, our attitudes, our perception. And geography also at this point is part of the frontier. A lot of it is. And when people got together and named teams geographically, they were looking at, I think, looking at it 4 different ways. One, a lot of times they just named their team after a physical place. So you might have Stones River or Green Mountain. They looked to indigenous animals like antelopes and wolverines. You had regional occupations, Dixie farmers and coal miners and the iron district. And then I think most importantly, you had this personal identification or even a group identification with the geographic region you lived in. So at a very early stage, the people in Ohio and people in Indiana were all referring to themselves as Buckeyes or Hoosiers, and they were naming their baseball teams accordingly. You cross the Mississippi and you get, the Sooners and the Jayhawks and the Hawkeyes. Go out to Utah, you've got the Skyscrapers. So, some of these names, it sounds like a Big Ten conference or Big 12 or something. But they identified with, quickly with where they lived. It's like where you're from is who you are, and they were proud of it. So that was a source of names. And in fact, geography is very prominent today in naming teams, particularly at the minor league levels. If you've ever seen the list of minor league teams, you'll see a lot of references to that particular geographic region. The Baltimore Orioles minor league franchise is an example. You have the Delmarva shorebirds, you know, an indigenous animal. You have the Bowie Bay Sox, which are it's a reference to the Chesapeake Bay. You have the Norfolk tides, you know, that's a seaport. Now, that might be a cosmic source, but I'm going with geography on that one. So geography, even today, is a source or an influence on named teams. Another area that attracted attention for naming teams was Native Americans. And that sort of stands to reason on the East Coast. I guess they're about 3 generations removed from struggling for the land, you know, that kill or be killed. That's history to them. You know, you've had the Romantic movement that has, you know, with the concept of the noble savage, and that's influenced literature with the Song of Hiawatha and the Last of the Mohicans with Uncas. So you see that. But when you cross the Appalachians, it's interesting that they're about 1 generation removed from really fighting for the land. I mean, there were a couple Indian wars in the Midwest and the Mid-South as late as the 1840s. So that was still pretty fresh in their memory, but they were still naming teams after Native Americans. And when you cross the Mississippi, where, you know, teams are forming in the late 1860s, they're forming in the early 1870s, but they, you know, there were actually in that struggle, it's kill or be killed. And they're still naming teams after Native Americans. So, you know, it kind of goes against the grain of the traditional historical narrative there, I think. Native Americans were perceived as possessing qualities admirable in a baseball player. They were considered fierce, strong, cunning, stoic warriors, prone to individual acts of heroism for the sake of tribe and honor. So this is a picture of the Salisbury team from the 1870s. They actually formed late in the 1860s. And the WC stands for White Cloud. He was a Indian chief in Minnesota. And in 1862, he had fought in the Dakota Wars and didn't fare too well there, but he remained as a leader of his people. And he garnered such respect over the years that in 1903, Minnesota actually built a statue to him. The White Cloud team set a precedent in that 50, 60 years later, the Eastern Shore League Class D minor league, the Salisbury entry was known as the Indians. They had derived their name from the White Cloud, but the reporters were still often referring to team as the White Cloud at that point. So, you know, 70 years later, they're still sort of in that rut. But I didn't see anything, at least in the 19th century, that would suggest that any of these names were in any way meant in a derogatory way. Not that they didn't, I just haven't seen anything. If a lot of these names, you know, call for categorization, some of them just don't seem to fit anything at all. And some of that, I think, is because people just didn't take themselves that seriously. And I'm sort of glad of that. Some of it's just my own ignorance in that I don't know what they meant by these things. You know, I don't know what German socks would connotate. I don't know what dicky birds would mean, or a lot of these others. You see some self-depreciation, and you have the wild throwers and the careless boys, and muffers is another favorite name that they went to in that regard. These were some of the popular names that I came across. Now, this is anecdotal. I didn't really, go through the Origins website and count them up, how many Excelsiors, Retinas, and Lone Stars, but these were obviously the more popular. And you'll notice that Pioneer is one of them. And it seems like in the 19th century in America, you had a tendency to think of yourself as a pioneer, no matter who you were or where you were. You'll find pioneers in Massachusetts, you'll find them in Missouri, you'll find them in California, and all points in between. And I don't think you necessarily had to be a citizen to be considered a pioneer, because a lot of the people moving west were Swedes or Irish or Germans or Chinese, and they consider themselves to be pioneers as well. So I seem to be going through this pretty quickly, but this last slide, I guess, is my defense of trying to go off on this wild tangent that I have. And I use Bernard Bail, and he's one of my favorite historians, and that he emphasizes the depiction of interior worlds, as historians. And we should look at attitudes, beliefs, and fears of people, their aspirations, and how that works in with the exterior worlds. And we should always try to be looking to put things in context. And then, I guess Peter probably said it best, though, when he said baseball history is more than baseball history. So that's kind of what I've tried to do here today, but to whatever success, I don't know. So that's all I have, I guess. So if there's any questions, comments.
John, you do. Thank you very, very much. That was an excellent presentation. Very interesting too. It is, just an amazing fact. I remember doing a little research way back when I was just a novice researcher, and I ran into. I was trying to ask the question: what were the true origins in baseball for the name the Giants? And I have a book here on my shelf somewhere behind me, I think, and it's baseball nicknames, and it's a very team names, very long book from A to Z, and actually the name that is most prevalent for American teams. Now these are all teams, unorganized, amateur, but somehow showed up, was Indians, and that was the most common name. And it's kind of interesting that now you have a situation where you have a major league team that may actually consider abandoning that name. So, or at least their logo, I'm sure they'll do that. But it's a very interesting phenomenon. You had a couple of comments here as you were going along about it. For example, for Excelsior, coming from a famous poem. Somebody commented that the team in Webster, Mass, was known as the Clippers, and of course, that having to do with clipper ships and so forth and so on. Tom Gilbert makes an observation. I don't know if he made it or he's quoting somebody. If you can't dance, you can't hit, and that was in relation to Tom Folks saying that quick steps was also a very popular dance at the time. So I guess if you could dance the quick step, you could hit. So that might have been some kind of.
Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on that one on agility. Whether it was dancing or alert, be alive, lively, and
right,
that sort of thing. So
right. Well, thank you again, John. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
And now, our next presenter is someone who was an